He chose to marry the alien girl everyone called weak and frail. Only he knew the truth about her. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The Velthani diplomatic delegation had been on Selim Station for 3 weeks before anyone outside the immediate diplomatic circle understood that the youngest member of the delegation, a woman named Iris who attended formal functions silently at the edge of every room and who had been described in the station's social briefings as the delegation's least significant member, was the actual reason the delegation existed. Marcus Holt did not know this when he met her. He knew, at the moment of meeting her, exactly what the station's social briefings had told him, which was that the Velthani delegation included a young woman of minor diplomatic rank who had a documented physical condition that limited her capacity for the standard ceremonial duties, and that she should be treated with appropriate accommodation but did not require the level of formal engagement that the senior delegation members required. The briefing had used the word frail. The briefing had used the word, specifically, in a tone that Marcus had read as institutional politeness covering institutional dismissal, which was a tone he recognized because he had spent 11 years in frontier diplomatic logistics and had read a great many briefings that performed care while communicating the opposite. He met her at the reception marking the 3rd week of negotiations between the Terran Frontier Authority and the Velthani Compact, a formal event in the station's upper ring reception hall that Marcus was attending in his professional capacity as logistics coordinator for the negotiation, which put him at the edge of every significant conversation without requiring him to be the center of any of them. He had developed, over 11 years, a specific skill for occupying that position productively, which involved paying attention to everything while appearing to be paying attention to the work in front of him. He noticed Iris because she was standing alone near the reception hall's eastern viewport, which looked out onto the deep space beyond the station, and because every other delegation member from both sides was engaged in the active social work that diplomatic receptions required and she was not. She was slight. The briefing's word frail was visually accurate in the surface sense, a slender frame, pale Velthani skin with a faint silver undertone that the species carried, large dark eyes that tracked the room with a stillness that Marcus's frontier logistics instincts read as something other than weakness, though he could not have said precisely what at the time. He approached because approaching the edges of rooms was what he did, and because the eastern viewport had a genuinely good view that he wanted to look at, and because 11 years of frontier logistics had taught him that the people standing alone at the edges of formal events were frequently the most informative people in the room if you were willing to have an actual conversation rather than a performed one. The cargo traffic from this angle is worth watching, he said by way of greeting, because it was true and because it was a more honest opening than any formal diplomatic phrase he could have used. You can see the full approach pattern for the outer docking ring. She looked at him. Her eyes did the specific thing that careful eyes did when assessing whether an approach was genuine or performed, and whatever she found in the assessment produced, after a moment, something that was not quite a smile but was in its territory. I have been watching it for 20 minutes, she said. Her Terran standard was precise and formal in the way of someone who had learned it through serious study. The 3rd vessel in the current sequence is using a non-standard approach vector. I believe the pilot is compensating for a minor thruster calibration issue rather than following a deliberate flight plan. Marcus looked at the 3rd vessel. He looked at the approach vector. He had spent 11 years in frontier logistics specifically because he found exactly this kind of detail genuinely interesting, and he ran the calculation she had just described and found that it held up completely. You're right, he said. That's a compensation pattern, not a planned vector. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone recalibrating. Most people don't read approach vectors at a diplomatic reception. Most people are not watching the cargo traffic, she said. I find it more informative than the conversations in this room. Marcus laughed, which was not the response he had planned and which surprised him slightly. That's fair, he said. I'm Marcus Holt, logistics coordinator for the Terran negotiation team. Iris, she said. Velthani delegation. He had read the briefing. He knew her full designation and the accommodation notes and the word frail. He did not mention any of it, because the conversation they were having was the most genuinely interesting conversation he had had at a diplomatic reception in 11 years, and the briefing's framing had nothing useful to add to it. What followed, over the next 2 hours of the reception, was a conversation that moved from cargo traffic patterns to station logistics architecture to the specific inefficiencies in the current Terran Velthani trade route proposals that neither delegation's formal documentation had identified, and Marcus found himself, somewhere in the 2nd hour, having the specific experience of discovering that the person he was talking to understood the negotiation's underlying logistics architecture more. Completely than anyone else in the room, including the senior delegation members whose formal role was to understand exactly that. He mentioned this carefully because he was aware he was approaching territory that the briefing had specifically not prepared him for. You understand the trade route logistics better than the people whose job is the trade route logistics, he said. Iris was quiet for a moment. Her dark eyes held his with the specific stillness he had noticed from across the room. I should tell you something, she said, and I would ask that you treat it with the discretion it requires until the formal announcement, which will come within the month. All right, Marcus said. I am not a minor delegation member with a documented physical condition, she said. I am the senior architect of the Terran-Velthani Compact Trade Proposal. I have been for 2 years. My title in this delegation is officially junior because Velthani diplomatic protocol requires that the architect of a major proposal not be publicly identified until the proposal reaches formal ratification stage. It prevents the kind of targeted political pressure that proposals of this scale attract during negotiation. She paused. The physical condition documentation is accurate, but its purpose in the briefing materials your side received was to provide a cover explanation for my reduced ceremonial visibility that did not reveal my actual role. The Velthani Compact's senior negotiators know who I am. The Terran briefing materials were given a simplified and, I am aware, somewhat dismissive framing. Marcus looked at her. He thought about 11 years of reading briefings that performed care while communicating dismissal, and he thought about the word frail used in a tone that he had recognized but had not, until this moment, fully understood the depth of what it was covering. You designed the proposal, he said. The full trade route restructuring, the resource allocation framework, the dispute resolution mechanism, she said. 2 years of work. I am 26 years old and I have a genuine physical condition that limits certain physical activities, which the Velthani Compact decided to use as the cover explanation because it required minimal fabrication and produced exactly the reduced visibility effect required. She held his gaze. I am telling you this because you have spent 2 hours speaking with me as though my observations about the negotiation were worth taking seriously on their own merit, without reference to my formal designation. That has not happened with anyone from the Terran delegation in 3 weeks. I wanted you to understand why it should have. Marcus sat with this for a moment in the specific way he sat with significant information, which was completely and without rushing to a response. The trade inefficiencies you identified earlier, he said, in the current proposal documentation, are inefficiencies in my own design, Iris said. I identified them 3 months ago. I have been unable to formally raise them because doing so before ratification would require revealing my role, which the timeline does not yet allow. She paused. I have been discussing them at receptions informally, hoping someone on either delegation would carry the observation forward without my needing to be its formal source. Marcus looked at her. He thought about the specific quality of someone who had spent 3 weeks at diplomatic receptions, standing at the edge of rooms, sharing genuinely significant insights about a proposal she had designed, and being received as a minor delegation member with a documented physical condition whose observations did not require the weight that her actual expertise deserved. I can raise them, he said, through the standard logistics review channel. I won't need to attribute the source. Logistics Review accepts anonymous technical submissions as standard practice for exactly this kind of sensitivity. Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and was adjacent to it. You would do that, she said. You identified real inefficiencies in a 2 billion credit trade framework, Marcus said. Raising them through the proper channel is the obviously correct thing to do. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm doing my job correctly, which happens to require listening to you. Iris looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that tracked the room with stillness that he now understood was not the stillness of someone weak, but the stillness of someone who had spent 2 years being the most significant architect of a major diplomatic framework while attending receptions as a minor delegation member, absorbing observations about her own work being dismissed without correction because the timeline required her silence. Most people, she said, upon learning what I have just told you, would respond differently. They would recalibrate their interest based on my actual rank rather than my actual capability. I was already interested, Marcus said. Your rank doesn't change what you said about the third vessel's thruster calibration. It also doesn't change what you said about the dispute resolution mechanism's structural gap. Both of those were true before I knew your title and they're true now. The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, when the Terran-Velthani Compact trade proposal reached ratification stage and the Velthani delegation's diplomatic protocol permitted the public identification of its architect. Iris stood at the formal ratification ceremony in the station's Grand Assembly Hall, in the position of senior architect rather than minor delegation member, and the room's reaction. Marcus watched it from his logistics coordinator position at the edge of the assembly, which was exactly where he had been standing 3 weeks ago when he had not known what he was looking at, was the specific reaction of an entire diplomatic community recalibrating in real time. He found her after the ceremony in the assembly hall's side corridor, where she had retreated for a moment of stillness that the formal recognition had apparently required as much as the original anonymity had. "You knew," he said, "when we talked at the reception. You knew this was coming." "I knew the timeline," she said. "I did not know how the 3 weeks between would go." She looked at him. "You raised the inefficiencies through the logistics review channel. Both of them were incorporated into the final framework before ratification." "They were correct," Marcus said. "Incorporating correct information is what the review channel is for. The dispute resolution mechanism revision alone will save the framework an estimated 40 million credits annually," Iris said. "The senior negotiators have been trying to identify the source of the anonymous submission for 2 weeks." "I imagine they have," Marcus said. She looked at him with an expression that had moved, somewhere in the 3 weeks, from the careful assessment of the reception to something considerably more direct. "Why didn't you tell them it was me?" she said. "After I told you. You could have raised your profile within the negotiation significantly by identifying the source of 2 major framework improvements as the delegation's actual senior architect." "You asked for discretion," Marcus said. "I provide what's asked for when the request is reasonable, and yours was." "That is not a complete answer," Iris said. Marcus looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not." He considered the rest of the answer for a moment because it was true and because the moment seemed to require completeness. "I also didn't want the value of talking to you to become about what I could get from knowing your title. The 2 hours at the reception were genuinely the most interesting conversation I'd had in 11 years of this work. That didn't need an additional reason attached to it." Iris was quiet for a long moment in the side corridor, the formal ratification ceremony's energy still audible from the main assembly hall behind them. "The Velthani Compact has a tradition," she said, "for individuals whose contribution to a partnership was made entirely on the basis of the work's merit, without reference to status, before status was known or available. It is not a formal diplomatic designation. It is a personal one." She paused. "I have not had occasion to use it before." "What does it mean?" Marcus said. "Approximately, one who saw the work before the rank," she said. "It is considered, in Velthani personal tradition, a significant quality in someone you would choose to build a life alongside." She held his gaze with those dark eyes that had tracked an entire room's recalibration with the same stillness she had used to track cargo traffic 3 weeks ago. "I am telling you this because the formal ratification ceremony concludes the professional phase of my role in this negotiation, and I find that I am, for the first time in 2 years, not required to manage the gap between my actual capability and my visible designation." Pause. "I would like to have dinner with you." "Not at a reception. Genuinely, simply dinner." Marcus looked at the architect of a 2 billion credit trade framework, who had spent 2 years being underestimated by design and 3 weeks specifically by him not at all, and he thought about cargo traffic and thruster calibration and the specific stillness of someone whose strength had never been physical in the way the briefing's word had implied and had never needed to be, because the strength that mattered had been there the entire time, visible to anyone who looked at the actual work, rather than the cover designation built to protect it. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." The Terran-Velthani Compact Trade Framework was implemented 6 months later with the dispute resolution mechanism intact exactly as Iris had originally designed it, before the inefficiency, before the 3-week gap, before the cover designation had required her silence about her own correction. The framework's official history credits her as senior architect. It does not include the detail of the reception conversation about a thruster calibration issue, or the anonymous logistics submission, or the side corridor after the ratification ceremony, because some details belong to a different kind of record than the official one, and that record, Marcus would say later, was the one that actually mattered.